Hey everyone, this is Dr. Drizzle and welcome to the National Parks Expedition Challenge. Today we are in Dry Tortugas National Park in South Florida, and just look at where we are. My feet are on the sand. We are just feet from the ocean, and there's amazing stuff here. But the two most amazing things here right now are our rangers. So let's get to know them real quickly. So Shannon, thanks so much for having us here today.
Thank you. It's great having you guys.
Well, tell us, how did you get to this park, and then we'll meet our other ranger.
So I got to this park. I studied marine sciences at the University of Florida. I actually switched my major a few times. Wasn't too sure what I wanted to get into and everything. But it was one of those things where I've always grown up in South Florida. I'm like happiest in nature, outside, like never feel happier than just being out here. So finally decided, I'm like, I can make a career out of this. And then I did know there's multiple internships available, like through the National Park Service and stuff. Know people that intern out in Everglades and stuff. Knew of Curtis, so pretty much hit him up right away, and I was like, heard you have internship opportunity coming up, let me know about it.
So you've been here since May?
Yep, since the end of May.
And this is the year 2022, so you've been here just a few months.
Yep.
So let's meet this Curtis guy that actually brought you here and us. So Curtis, it's so good to see you again.
It's wonderful to see you as well, Daisha.
So how did you get here?
Well, it all really began with my mother, to be completely honest. And I was born not too far from here in Marathon, Florida, which is right dead center of the Keys. And my dad used to run charter fishing trips out here when I was a little kid. So not only am I working in this park, but it is the very first park that I had the opportunity to visit when I was a 3-year-old child. So pretty special. And I joined the Navy afterwards as a Navy diver for many years. And then I too came into the park through an internship called the Pathways program. Miss Channing came through the park through the Greening Youth program. So there's a lot of different programs out there. Pathways is a great one. We've got Greening Youth, we've got SCA, a lot of different internship opportunities. But I too came in as an intern, and then as a term employee, and then as a permanent employee thereafter.
How long have you been here?
I've been here just over 7 years, so I'm going on 7-8 years. I found my park. I love this place. I get to work with diverse people. I get a host of duties. I get to drive boats. I get to dive. I get to do education programs. I get to run our volunteer program. It is the place for me. I love it. I get this amazing cultural resources and these magnificent natural resources.
Well, tell us a little bit about Dry Tortugas. How did it come to be?
Ooh, to do that, we really have to jump on the time machine and go back.
Oh, I'm jumping too. Hang on.
We've got to go back in time to the early days of exploration. So not long after Christopher Columbus's first inaugural journey over to the New World, we started knowing that there was land north. Okay, and so north of Cuba, there are maps that date back to 1511 that show land north of Cuba, and that was the beginning of Florida. And then in 1513, Ponce de Leon took his initial voyage and he went up and founded St. Augustine. Then he came around to the west coast of Florida, and with 2 Calusa guides, they led him down to a land that was flowing with provisions for their sailors. This land was flowing with turtles and with seabirds, and at the time, Caribbean monk seals. Once Ponce de Leon landed, he was so impressed with these islands, he named them Las Tortugas. So put one hand out for me just like this. Put your other hand just like that. Now wiggle those thumbs. That is the Tortuga right there.
Nice, nice. Kids, are you doing that?
Yep.
I hope you're doing that.
You got to do that. So that's how we say, hey, look, there's turtles when we're in the water and we can't talk. So that's where that came from. But turtles, we love to admire them today, but they were actually provided vital sustenance to sailors back in the day, because you can take one of those large turtles down on the lower decks of a ship, flip it upside down, dump water on it, it can't rewrite itself, and it can live for weeks at a time. So in those early 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, before they had refrigeration, to be able to have live meat for your sailors as you journey back over to Spain with all that silver and gold and coin that you just took from South America, you needed fresh meat, and that's what it was. It was turtles, and they actually took some Caribbean monk seals as well. 7 of them on their initial voyage, and that is very unfortunate because now those Caribbean monk seals are extinct. However, the turtles are now protected, and this year we're having a record year. We've had over 680 nests so far this year of loggerhead and green turtles, which is quite remarkable. All right, so now we're gonna skip a couple hundred years.
Do we need the time thing again? Do we need to do this again?
Well, we could do the time thing again. We're gonna go a couple hundred years. There was piracy. There were different countries kind of coming after each other, England and Spain and France, and there were tons of shipwrecks here. So this place provided sustenance and shelter, but it also provided demise for many, many shipwrecks as well. We have over 350 shipwrecks scattered throughout the 100 square mile park that we see here. And only 1%, well, it's about 1.5% of the park is terrestrial. So it is a true marine park as well. All right, so after quite a few things happen that go into the Louisiana Purchase in the early 1800s, and then with us acquiring Florida from Spain in the 1820s, they knew that this was a vital strategic location. And there was a war that happened back in 1812 where the Britons literally stormed our capital and burnt portions of it to the ground. Kids, if you go to our capital today, you can still go to one of those walls that is still got black marks on it and it's still scorched to remind us of that. And so we didn't have a navy to rival these European forces. What if Spain wanted to attack us next? Britain, France. We had no navy. Well, what we had was a coastal fort in Baltimore that never fell. That flag was still flying. There was a guy who wrote a song about it. Does anybody remember that song? Yeah. There were bombs bursting in air, something along those lines. All right, so Congress got together. They said, since Baltimore never fell, why don't we build a strong coastal defense system? And they named it the third system of fortifications. They built forts all the way down the East Coast. You might have some that you've seen, forts like Pulaski, Fort Zachary Taylor in Key West, Florida. And they came all the way out here and built this fort, Fort Jefferson. Now, we're in the southernmost part of the United States. Not long after they started building this fort in the 1840s, something happened called the Civil War in the 1860s, right? Southernmost part of the United States, do you think this was a northern fort or a southern fort?
Go ahead and tell us.
It was actually controlled by the North. And so that is a very, very important fact. So the southernmost part of the United States during the Civil War was controlled by the North. And part of Abraham Lincoln's plan was to do, it's called the Anaconda Plan. He came right down the Mississippi, went through a lot of different parks right there. And then we wanted to do kind of like a chokehold of their supplies, because you need certain things to fight a war, like cannons, cannonballs, gunpowder. You also need things like money. And what was the Civil War really all about if we really want to get down to the nitty-gritty? It was about slavery. Why did the South need slaves? They needed slaves for the cotton. Right after the cotton gin got invented, cotton became much, much more important. And they were selling cotton at that time over to Europe to finance the war. So not only did we cut the supplies that they needed to fight the war, we cut the funding that they needed to fund the war. So that's a little bit of the history there. I can go on and on about all the different things that happened at this fort. There was a period of significance after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The 4 people that were responsible for the plotting against him were also stationed here. It became a prison initially for Union troops, but then it also did hold some Southern troops as well. And there's so many amazing things about this place. And it's not just this cultural resource. That place is so much more than just a big pile of bricks, kids. It's also about a convergence of tides, and I would say a convergence of human history and natural resources. It became a national monument in 1935, and then all this beauty that you see around, we have corals that spawn here, we have economically important species of fish that spawn here, we have turtles, we have birds that nest here, like the masked booby birds. It's the only place in the contiguous US where they nest here. Magnificent frigate birds as well. They said, you know what, we actually need to protect all those natural resources as well, not just the cultural resource. So we had Dry Tortugas National Monument in 1935. In 1992, they expanded it to Dry Tortugas National Park.
That is huge. And kids, we want you to remember that these are just a glimpse into the national parks. There's a lot of research and study that you can do on this also. But when you talked about Fort Jefferson, it made me think, Channing, I heard, and I'm not sure if this was true, is there a tie to the Underground Railroad here?
Yes, there actually
Can you
is.
tell us about that?
Yeah, so on July 10th, 1847, we had 7 enslaved laborers that decided they were going to escape. So just after midnight, they had gone, taken one of the schooners, and before they took that schooner, they had destroyed the 2 other schooners and the small lighthouse keeper's ship, just so that if people were trying to chase them, get them, it'd be difficult. They just destroyed any way they'd be able to get them. So they were able to leave on the schooner, and they made it probably about 15 miles off of Garden Key. By 7 a.m., they realized they escaped. They had escaped searching for freedom, and they were unfortunately captured.
But you know what? Channing brings up a really good point. So part of this huge, massive, the most ambitious coastal fortification the United States has ever designed, most powerful fort ever constructed. It was going to hold over 400 cannons, over 120 of which could fire at a single target at one time. I mean, it was a feat of modern engineering, and guess what? It was built in large part by enslaved laborers. So it was built by enslaved laborers, people that were not given the basic freedoms of life. And then after the Emancipation Proclamation, it was also one of the first places where African regiment of troops were stationed to guard prisoners. Let's think about that. I was not granted freedoms, and I show up a year and a half later wearing a uniform to defend freedoms for which I never had. It gives me goosebumps just thinking and talking about that.
So those 7 enslaved laborers on their journey to freedom, just a few years later, that happened for the rest of them.
Just a few short years later, this was one of the first African regiments of troops were stationed to guard prisoners. Absolutely, and defend the freedoms. This is also known as the gateway to the Gulf because we are at a convergence of different oceans. So right here on my left, we have the Gulf waters. Directly across 20 yards of that island, we have the Atlantic waters, and we are at the northern edge of the Caribbean waters. And the Florida Straits, also known as the Gulf Stream, run just north of us about 2 miles away. So this was a hub for shipping. Basically, this is like the artery where that blood flows through here. And that heartbeat is our coral reef.
Nice, nice. Well, we know about the cultural history, so let's talk about these natural resources also. There are so many here. Channing, let me ask you just for a moment, what are your favorite animals here at the park?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Honestly, the sharks, 100% the sharks. I even got to work with a huge shark researcher, Wes Pratt, who has the longest running shark study in the world. And last time I was out with him, actually, I was able to name a nurse shark.
And what did you name that nurse shark?
Hash brown.
Hash brown. Now, do you have a love of hash browns, or it just came to you?
Just came to me. I was at the vet the day before. There was a puppy named Hash Brown, and I was like, the next animal I get to name Hash Brown, I'm going to name it, and it just so happened to be a nurse shark.
So hopefully this shark will return.
Oh, I hope so, yeah.
And then you can say, I knew you win.
Yep. Pretty.
Absolutely. Well, tell us a little bit about the research that happens here.
Well, and I want to go into that returning research. So like Channing just mentioned, because it's the longest ongoing shark research in the history of the world, not just our nation. So he's been doing it for 31 years. And some of those sharks that came back this year, it's their 31st year. There was 30 years. He tagged them back before in like 1991, thereabouts. And so when they initially started this research, they thought nurse sharks lived to be about 30 years. So kids, later, if you're opening one of those books and you're reading that nurse sharks live to be 70 years old, that very research was done about a half a football field's length away, right over there. And they come up in the shallows where the sharks come in and the females put their pectoral flippers down and they kind of line up, and the guys have to come in there and try to flip them over to get them to mate. It's very interesting, and you can watch it occur in shallow water. So it's very amazing. And that is done, like they said, through Nick Pratt and Nick Ledley. But we have so many research projects going on here. There's so much scientific research, and that is done through partnerships. For instance, the Mackay is out here right now. We have NOAA on that vessel. We have FWC. We have quite a few NPS rangers. We've got University of Virgin Islands. We have FWC law enforcement here right now. We have the Nature Conservancy that helps maintain our coral nursery. What? We have a coral nursery?
A nursery.
We have a nursery where we grow corals on trees. We have PVC trees where we actually grow corals on trees, and then we go out and we plant them on the reefs. Our next one is going to be in October, where we'll be planting them on the reefs to help regrow our reef systems, because globally reefs are on a decline. So therefore we're doing our part to treat diseased corals that have a condition called stony coral tissue loss disease. But then we're also doing coral restoration with partners such as the Nature Conservancy. We have some FWC that is helping us out as well. And we're trying to regrow our reef systems back to a way in which they were. And then we have other researchers like the United States Geological Survey that has been doing turtle research, where we've learned about their size and their abundance and their migratory patterns. And then they also do some geology, because is coral a plant, is it an animal, or is it a rock? What do you think?
What do you think, kids?
Well, if you said animal, you wouldn't be wrong. If you said plant, you wouldn't be wrong either. And guess what? It also makes a hard calcium carbonate shell, so it's really all three of those things. It's in the animal kingdom, so it is an animal. It's got these tiny polyps where it feeds, but it has a plant that lives inside of it called zooxanthellae, and it photosynthesizes just like a regular plant does. It takes in that sunlight, and then it produces oxygen as well. And so it actually feeds itself as well. It gets about 90% of its food from the sun. That's why we find corals in clear water. That clear water is actually nutrient deficient. It's similar to a desert, but that clear water gives the chance for those sunlight rays to penetrate down and that plant to grow and flourish inside of the coral. And when we hear coral bleaching, that coral's not dying. What's happening is that actual zooxanthellae is getting disturbed and it's leaving the coral. And that zooxanthellae is what gives it that coral. So then all of a sudden it'll turn white and pale. So we have amazing corals here. There are about 66 species of corals in the Caribbean basin. So from Florida all the way down through the Caribbean, we have about 33 species in the coral of the Florida Keys Reef Tract, and all 33 of those species can be found right out here, and especially off of Loggerhead, because we have 7 keys here. Initially, when Ponce de Leon was led here by the Calusa Indians, there were 11 islands. Now we have 7. Sea level is coming up. We're noticing this, and there's a history of that. One of our most amazing islands is right over there, the biggest one. It is called Loggerhead Key. It was named after those sea turtles. It's our biggest island. It's 45 acres. And we had the very first tropical marine biology laboratory in the Western Hemisphere was formed on that. So think about Garden Key as a strategic location from a military perspective, and Loggerhead Key as a strategic location for our natural resources. And they did things such as the very first underwater photograph was taken right here in the Dry Tortugas of a hogfish.
Wow.
And then in today's science, FWC, so that's Florida Fish and Wildlife, is doing a research project on hogfish, and it is the most comprehensive research project on hogfish in the history of our nation as well, where they're going down, catching them with nets, putting little devices on inside their belly, and they have an acoustic array so they can see their movements and they can see how they spawn and see how they grow, because it's such a tasty fish and there's so much fishing pressure that we're trying to study these fish, and that study is going on right here. And it all started with the Carnegie Marine Lab, and also even back during the early days with Joseph Holder. He was the lead surgeon, and he also doubled as a naturalist. And his son, Charles Holder, who came here as a 7-year-old, grew up here for roughly 10 years. He then went on to land the first big tuna over in California and is accredited with being the father of sports fishing. And it's a little kid who grew up in the Dry Tortugas, Charles Holder.
And that just shows you that you can do a lot of stuff, kids, which is going to lead us to actually a sad thing. So the coral reef, which you guys are doing such a great research project with, something is impacting them though.
Correct.
What is impacting our coral reef?
A lot of everything. It's like a perfect storm, and so climate change is definitely impacting them. Think of that as like the big macro things. So temperatures are increasing, the corals get stressed out, they'll bleach. pH balances, they're also very sensitive to the water quality. So when the pH balance gets off or the salinity gets off, there's certain things that can impact them as well. There's also direct impacts that we're doing that affect them as well. So when we have a lot of boaters that come up that want to recreate and they drop an anchor directly on the coral, bam, it damages the coral and it can kill it, it can break it apart in different pieces. So therefore we're putting different systems in called mooring buoy systems, and we have an area of the park, we try to balance the park. So about 50% of our park you can fish in. We can even do fishing programs with our youth out here. We have a junior angler fishing program that is also funded through the National Park Foundation that we do with our youth. And so you can fish in about 50% of the park, 50% of the park you cannot fish in, and that's our research natural area. So that's how we balance, you know, our different uses and conservation here.
I also heard that as our human impact gets worse in some places, these corals are also, the polyps are also ingesting plastics that we might be putting in the water. Can you tell us about that?
When we have a plastic water bottle, like I picked up on the beach today, there's plastic water bottles all over the place. You could see them down here. The plastic breaks down into microplastics, so they're a little bit smaller. And the fish will eat the microplastics, then a bigger fish will eat that fish, and then we eat that bigger fish. So we're literally eating our own trash, and there have been studies on that. When the plastic breaks down even smaller from microplastics into nanoplastics, scientists have done tests on that where it shows that the corals, when the polyps are trying to feed, are ingesting that plastic. When corals ingest plastic like that, they can become a vector for other diseases. So if we're wondering why our corals are getting white band disease, black band disease, stony coral tissue loss, their immune system has been weakened by things that we're doing and putting into the water, such as plastics.
All right, kids, so here's your chance to help. As you know, we tie all of our national parks to the UN Sustainability Goals, 1 through 17. So since Ranger Curtis has talked about microplastics, we're going to use goal 14, which is life below water. We know that microplastics can hurt lots of the underwater sea creatures. But you know what? We didn't talk about something that I'm wearing right here. So before we actually issue the challenge, we know that microplastics also hurt sea turtles. So tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll come together for our challenge.
You're absolutely right, absolutely right. Turtles near and dear to all of our hearts, of course they are. So, and I also want to bring in, even though we are at America's most remote national park within the contiguous US, we have parks further south of us, like in the southern hemisphere, like American Samoa. We have more remote parks like in Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, but in the contiguous US, we are the most remote national parks. Plastics that are put into the water, even in your backyards, even in Ohio, maybe even in the middle of America, can end up right here on the Florida Keys Reef Tract because we're connected through rivers and streams, okay? So a creek that might be by your house that runs into the Mississippi River, when that Mississippi River dumps out into the Gulf, the loop currents bring it up, and then it comes around and it hits the Gulf Stream and it deposits right on this reef system right here. And that's when those microplastics are breaking down. So now they're floating in the ocean for months at a time, and they're picking up algae. They're picking up the scent of what the ocean smells like. So when turtles see them, and it's mostly baby turtles, when they see those small things that look like eggs, they start munching on them. And as that plastic continues to go up in that Gulf Stream and it goes out to the Sargasso Sea, which is where our turtles go to get a little bit bigger, they ingest a lot more of them. So it's very hazardous to this beautiful charismatic species as well.
So we want to save the sea turtles, we want to save the coral reef, but we also want to give you a chance to be a really good human. So what we're going to ask you to do is to brainstorm with kids in your classroom ways that we can stop this plastic from even arriving in Dry Tortugas. What can you do around your school to eliminate the possibilities of plastics? Can you try new types of materials? Can you use a water bottle every day instead of buying a new plastic bottle every week? Can you make sure that around your areas in the school that you're picking up plastics every day? Because remember, the 16-ounce bottle is going to break down into those micro and nano plastics, and that's where the biggest concern is happening in places like the Dry Tortugas. We want you to come up with a really good plan on how you're going to stop the use of plastics, or at least eliminate the overuse of plastics in your area, so that they don't get down here to places like the Dry Tortugas and affect these beautiful sea turtles that are actually going to be hatching right behind us. We'll show you that in just a little bit. You're going to come up with your plan. You can design a prototype if you're coming up with a new type of recycling bin at your school that you can use. Maybe you want to slap a picture of a sea turtle from Dry Tortugas right on top of that, or maybe some beautiful coral reef, so that you can give other people around you that haven't developed your heart for this yet a reason to care, a reason to be a good human. So once you create all this amazing stuff, we want to make sure that you tag us at Dacia92 and hashtag NatParkChallenge. I'm excited because I think these kids could be the next best thing here to help you. Even though they may be in Oregon or up in Maine or over in Texas, they can have an impact here at this national park. What do you think?
You're right, Dacia. It is instrumental. I've been doing beach cleanups in this area for the last 8 years, and it's only getting worse. And we're never gonna make an impact simply by picking up the trash along here. We have, think about a wreck on the freeway. Unless we slow the traffic coming down on that on-ramp, we're never going to make a difference. And that's why we need our youth. We need help here in order to really make an impact. Just doing beach cleanups is not doing the justice for these threatened and endangered species that we're trying to protect.
I didn't get very close, but what is this?
You know what? Call it like you see it. It is a hole. And it's a hole from a big mama turtle who came up here. So she waddled up here using those front flippers, and she laid down right here, and then she used these rear flippers, and she needed a hole about 3 foot deep, maybe even a little bit bigger. And then she laid eggs, up to 120 of them right here. After she laid all those eggs, she doesn't want that hole to remain open. There's a lot of predation that can come on here. There's a lot of crabs that can come eat them. So then she took these front flippers, and you can see it, and she started tossing the sand, putting it all over here. You can actually see these are her flipper marks right here. And then she covered her babies, and they're gonna be right down in here, about 3 foot. And when did she do this? If I look at this stake right here, it says B09, so that's Bush Key. We're on Bush Key right now. 09, that's for the month, September. 01, so on the first of the month. 22, so that she just laid those. So the reason that we mark those like that is we'll come back in about 2 months. That's when the babies should emerge and start coming out. So all those babies are gonna start hatching in roughly about 60 days. Hence the Tortugas, the land of the turtles.
Channing, some of these kids are not that far off in age of you, right? They sort of see you and think, wait a minute, I could do this. Would you look in that middle camera right there, and is there any advice you can give these kids on what they could do now to start preparing for a career in the national parks?
Honestly, my best advice would be to just be open to anything. Like, it's completely okay to change your mind. Like, you're young, you want to be able to figure out what you're into, what makes you happy, what makes you tick. Because if you're passionate about it, then you'll make other people passionate about it, and that's how we can make this difference.
Perfect. And what about you, Curtis? Can you tell the kids what you're thinking?
Absolutely, and she touched on a lot of great things as well. Like I said, the internships, being able to look, there's so many that are out there, and don't be scared to kind of put your name out there to maybe find that passion. Also, there's routes in through the military as well. Like I said, I was a military diver for over 10 years doing that, and so you can also come in segues through that ways. With Pathways, there's 3 different programs in that, because there's internships, there are postgraduate programs, and then there's one called Presidential Management Fellowship Program. So there are quite a few, and not just in the National Park Service, but in federal agencies as well, and even working for different non-for-profits as well. You can work for that and then get credit towards federal employment as well.
So there are a lot of ways that you can invest into the national parks, but you can start doing it now by being a good steward of the land where you live and coming up with ideas to save these and preserve these beautiful national parks. You know, our motto is, when your passion intersects your purpose, then you have found your career for life.
And I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with. Secretary Deb Haaland just came out with a secretary order to reduce plastic and eliminate single-use plastics in federal lands. So I'm looking very, very forward to seeing what you come up with.
Us too. So on behalf of Expeditions and Education, this is the National Parks Expedition Challenge with Rangers Channing and Curtis, and we are out of here.
See ya.